Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good, Nicholas, and yourself?
I'm pretty good as one can be for Monday. And I am also joined today by Dr. John Endres. John, how are you doing?
All good. Hi, Nicholas. Hello, listeners. Hi, Terence.
Yep.
John, you just sound like you've switched to the wrong mic there because you've gotten very far away and echoey. So
Is that better?
that is
That's
much
much better.
better. There we
Okay.
go. Right. So let's get stuck into it. And I think we should talk about what for me sends an absolute shiver down my spine. And this is Eskom's load limiting project. So when you have a shortage of electricity, there's lots of different ways that the system can try and reduce the amount of power everyone is using. People can install power saving stuff. You can have load shedding, which is what we currently have, right? Where you switch off the power for a certain amount of hours for certain areas. You get zero power for some hours of the day, but then you get full power for other hours of the day. But Eskom is pretty interested in reducing the impact of load shedding for obvious reasons. And so they are talking about a new project called load limiting. So the idea of this is that the amount of power sent to each individual customer is less. Especially during periods of load shedding. So to research the feasibility of this project, Eskom has started it here in Johannesburg in Fourways, which interestingly enough this part of Fourways is served by Eskom, not by City Power, which is the Joburg utility, which is a sort of odd curiosity. But anyway, and the idea of this thing is so that you'll normally get 60 to 80 amps, and they're going to reduce it to 10 amps. And the idea is that you'll be able to still have lights and some basic appliances on, but things like kettles and pool pumps and anything that takes a fair amount of power won't work. So that's the idea anyway. So the pilot project has begun, and they've tried it out. And according to a local DA ward councillor, David Foley, there were quite a few problems. A lot of residents had intermittent power supply with lights flickering off on and off every few seconds. Other people lost power. He said people's lights would go on and off, causing problems. On Thursday, I went to help some of the elderly and turned on their electricity boxes outside their homes. It seems the problem is getting resolved by Eskom. A resident who followed the rules she said she turned off her pool pump and a geyser and all the things that Eskom told them to do. Said, without fail, when load shedding began, our power turned off and on every 5 seconds for up to 10 minutes in a row. This is not limited to the start of the load shedding slot. Our power is then turned off completely until the end of the load shedding slot, and sometimes over the scheduled time. Eskom said that they are aware of the challenges experienced by customers during load shedding, the load limiting, and the matter is being investigated, and they apologize for the inconvenience. Now, the reason this sends a shiver up my spine is because, as this little pilot project reveals, I suspect if this were rolled out on a large scale, it would be utterly disastrous, with everything from appliances being destroyed by weird fluctuations in power and voltage, to people just losing power anyway, to the grid tripping, to all sorts of chaos. John, let me start with you. What do you make of this proposal? Is this a good idea? Am I right in my skepticism?
Well, I think we are clearly in a rationing kind of situation, and some of the comments we're seeing in the chat from Lars support that, which is that there's not enough supply to meet demand. And it's like when at your house you want to entertain some guests, and you get out the tablecloth for the table, and you took the wrong one out, which is too small for the table. And you try tugging it the one way to make it cover the table. You try tugging it the other way to cover the table, but still, it's not going to cover the table. And it's the same with our electricity, that it just isn't enough to go around at the moment. So we're managing that shortage through rationing, and load shedding is a form of rationing. And this load limiting would be another form of rationing, just a different form. And in the abstract, I can see the appeal of it. I can see, why it might be nice. It's sort of like having a small inverter in your house instead of you having to supply it, so you can keep the lights going and the internet and the TV. Instead of you having to supply that, Eskom will do that for you. They'll give you like a little 10 amp inverter, effectively, and you can keep a few things going even if the big stuff doesn't work.
Right, it's definitely a more nimble solution.
Yes, exactly. And
In theory.
so that's actually not. Sorry, Nick.
In theory, It's a more
In theory, exactly, yes. So that was the theory of the matter. And if it worked, it would be quite beautiful. And you'd be sitting in your house and you'd hardly even notice load shedding, except that at certain times, your pool pump or your electric heater wouldn't work, or your geyser. Otherwise, stuff, you would not notice the impact of load shedding quite as much. But then, of course, there's the gap between reality and theory. And I think that's what we're seeing here in 4 ways. Your skepticism, I think, was well-founded. I suspect that Eskom is going to persist in its attempts to make this work, and maybe they will, and maybe they won't. But it is a sophisticated solution to a problem, and I'm not sure that we are the kind of country at this stage that does sophisticated solutions, and maybe we just need a simple solution like load shedding. Nick.
Or more specifically, that Eskom is not the kind of company that can manage a sophisticated solution. Had we a private distribution grid or private electricity provider, I would be more willing to try out something like this. At the very least, if you lost all of your electronic equipment to a mistake that the distributor made, you wouldn't have to then tackle the horrors of bureaucracy that would no doubt come with trying to engage with Eskom. Terence, what do you make of this story? Do you agree with John? This seems to me a kind of typical problem with the way that governance is done in South Africa, which is we go for the fancy solution, we go for the high-tech solution, and it's worth noting that, and I think to the great shame of the anti-ANC coalition, they also supported this initiative in Johannesburg, and the ANC is in favor of it. So at the moment, no, I don't think any of the major political parties are actually against this, and it seems to me like it's really shooting for the moon when we should just focus on getting airborne first. What do you make of this?
Yeah, look, I'm in 2 minds. On the one hand, I do think that as John says, a kind of Eskom provided inverter, and it's really a case of making lemonade out of lemons. It's a bad situation. You try to make the best of it. I'm a little curious, when your power is cut to that level, is that just those higher, more consumptive devices don't work, or you're not supposed to use them? Because unless there is something that renders them inoperable, you're invariably going to have this sort of free rider problem of someone saying, well, the rest of the neighborhood can switch off. I'm going full tilt.
So I do think the idea is that there's just not enough power for those things to work, and if you turn them on, it might trip your house.
And I think, sorry, Terence, if I can just mention that what they do is that they give you the opportunity to switch off your big consumers. Right. And if you don't, you'll receive some sort of signal like flickering of lights or something, right, which tells you now really go and switch off your geyser. And if you don't, then you just get load shed.
Right.
I'm putting it politely.
It's supposed to be more. It's supposed to be more individualized through the smart meter system. Yeah. That's kind of the idea here.
Well, okay. Look, I think that's one of the first issues. The smart metering. Not everyone has that, so there's limits on how far you can roll it out. Look, I think that in fairness to Eskom, this is a pilot project. So maybe they'll be able to work out these bugs. My concern is that they've sort of half got the bugs worked out, and they eager for no one to go into the election, without some market improvement that they can point to, and so we just barrel full steam ahead with a system not working properly, with the administrative capacity not to make it function as it should. And I leave it to the imagination, how that one works out.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Eskom more broadly. Things have been going better for Eskom in recent weeks than they have for a while. Demand was apparently lower than expected. And as a result, the Eskom says this week, and Electricity Minister Lorimer says that due to the lower demand, to the fewer breakdowns that have happened, they expected a certain number of breakdowns to happen at the coal power plants, but that hasn't happened. I think we can speculate in our discussion as to why that might be. But as a result of things going better than expected, Eskom is able to take more of the plants offline for maintenance this winter than they had originally planned. So they had originally planned to take very little offline for plant maintenance, expecting lots of breakdowns, expecting high demand, and it hasn't been as severe as they thought. John, this has now begun a conversation in the country that maybe load shedding is actually not as sort of intractable a problem, and things might be turning around and looking up. Is that true? And secondly, what do you make of the reasons for why there have been fewer breakdowns and why the situation is better than it was at the beginning of the year?
Well, I think the first comment is that I think we feel pathetically grateful at being in only stage 1 or stage 3 load shedding compared to what we had earlier in the year, which is a reflection on the state of the country, the state that we got to. So we're now quite happy, sitting very comfortable with stage 1 to 3 load shedding, which is amazing. Is it going to last? We're not sure. We think probably not. We've been looking into this a little bit to understand why load shedding has been lower since it's pretty much exactly like since the beginning of June. So for 1 month now, it's been lower than before. And one of the reasons does seem to be that demand is lower. So there's just not as much of a mismatch between supply and demand. It probably is also the case that more diesel has been burnt, or the open cycle gas turbines have been run at a higher rate just to keep the lights on. It may also be the case that the wind plants have produced more power than they did in previous months. So there's a few different factors at play here that all seem to be conspiring in our favor, which we should be grateful for. But the one that really matters, of course, is whether the plant is becoming more reliable or not. The energy availability factor, I think, has gone up. But whether that's sustainable or not is the big question. And I have my doubts about that, because even if you can boost the reliability with short-term measures to make it improve on a long-term basis, does take time and work. So if you're putting in the maintenance times, the overhauls, the refurbishments, and so on, that doesn't happen overnight. And it would seem unlikely that you get the benefit of those kinds of changes happening from beginning of June and then just remaining in place through the rest of the year and into the glorious future. So my expectation at the moment is that we're going to see load shedding creeping up again as plants starts breaking down again, unfortunately. Nick?
Before I let you go on that one, John, do you think we'll see stage 8 this year? Are you willing to make such a call?
In the autumn, I thought we were going to, and now I don't think we're going to, because I think we might just ride this wave of slightly better availability into the spring when demand for electricity goes down, and sort of just skirt that. If we get through winter without stage 8, we'll probably be okay to the end of the year. There's also 3 units of Kusile coming back on stream in November, right, which contribute 2.4 megawatts of production. So that's like 2 stages of load shedding. So if we get all the way through to November, we'll manage to survive without stage 8 load shedding.
I think that's 2.4 gigawatts of load shedding. Terence, final thoughts on this before we move on?
No, I just endorse what John says, and I think the real problem is the wild cards of unanticipated breakdowns. Couple of units going offline can upset the whole thing. Maybe not stage 8, but I do think our old friend stage 6 might be back at some point.
So I took a bet with some of my housemates at the beginning of this year on this topic, and my non-insider information, layman eyeballing it guess was that it's going to happen in August, and it's going to be the last cold snap of the year when power demand suddenly unexpectedly surges just as they've begun the spring cycle of maintenance. Anyway, that's my guess. I have no idea. Okay, so let's move on to our next one, and this is a topic we've talked about quite a bit, but it's back, and that is that the unions are beginning to freak out in some of the mines that there's going to be major layoffs ahead. So a spokesperson for the National Union of Mine Workers in Mpumalanga, he's I think the acting regional secretary. I wonder what happened to the regional secretary. Anyway, that the union has received warnings from 3 different companies that if the rail system does not improve soon, they are going to have to begin significant layoffs among workers. Now, he said he wasn't going to say which companies these were because he didn't want to panic workers. He went on to say that the reason that this was a really big problem now and hadn't been in the past, he said, quote, in the past, even if they were transporting less, the price of coal was good, but now it has dropped, and so they cannot transport enough. There's also some experts in the mining organizations which confirm this, that due to the huge drop in rail traffic, there just aren't enough. There isn't enough capacity on the roads, even if you use trucks to try and get the coal out of the country. There are so many problems on, particularly, I think, that N3 highway, roads accidents, strikes, breakdowns, that kind of stuff, that just prevent them from being able to move out all the coal with trucks. And that means they're going to just have coal sitting around. And if it can't be sold, then it's costing them money, and they're going to have to lay off people. That's the idea here. The chief commercial officer at Transnet Freight Rail said the country's rail capacity has been constrained by underinvestment, rising incidents of theft and vandalism, and damage to the rail network by so-called business forums, as well as cable theft. John, what's your take on this?
Well, the facts are as you set them out. So last year, coal prices were very high, and I think we could afford to not be as efficient in our exports, even though it still cost us money. But as a country, having a happy-go-lucky attitude, sort of commodity windfalls and high prices bailing us out, is not going to work forever. And this year it's not working in the coal industry, and it's not going to work in other industries as well, because you've ultimately got to get your act together and make stuff work properly. So the sort of commodities exporters are now under stress with the risk to employment. But in that article which you shared with us, Nick, I thought the most interesting little factoid was in the very last paragraph, and which may be also slightly different from the way that we've spoken about this story before. Because what it says there is that since the deployment of coal customer-funded security interventions, there has been a 34% reduction in security-related incidents per week on the coal line. So we saw a few weeks back now, private business, another initiative to help the government fix problems in transport, electricity, and crime, saying that they're going to get involved. Some of those companies seem to be a lot more gung-ho than they were before, in the sense of saying, this time we're going to take the lead, we're going to make sure it works, and we're not going to take our lead from the government, because that doesn't work. We know that already. And this is like a first little indication, I think, of that kind of approach actually working, where these iron and coal exporters say, we're building up huge piles of iron ore and coal, which we can't ship. It's costing us money. We've got to do something about this. We're actually going to, just put drones down, 35 drones. I see 86 security task teams. We're going to put the resources in to make sure that the goods continue flowing. And that's actually quite a positive development. And I hope they continue doing that. And, more and more, I think that's going to be where things are heading. If you want something to get done, you've got to do it yourself. As an individual South African or as a company, got to do things yourself. And sometimes with or without the government. Nick?
Right. And I think it also speaks to how much of this is not just sort of underinvestment or incompetence or whatever. It's actually, there's deliberate nonsense going on here. Here they talk about, of course, the role of the so-called business forums, which are often thinly disguised mafias that are operating to just sort of tear things down. And as we know, a big part of the Eskom story, to just go back to the last story, is also due to mafias operating to break stuff in the stations. And I wonder if they're less active now than they have been for some reason. Interesting to think about. Terence, what's your take on this story? Go ahead.
Yeah, look, it's a concept that I've come back to for years. The idea of the developmental state, the thing that animates a lot of thinking on the part of the government. That following the example of Singapore, South Korea, or latterly China, the state will take a central role in the economy and use it to discipline capital and drive forward ourselves into the sunlit uplands of developmental utopia. My response to that is, if we can get the Singaporean civil service to do that, then I'm all for it. The problem is that the state itself has become has become not just a non-enabler, but often a deformer and a disenabler of these things. I mean, yeah, rail is, I think, quite unfairly, because we don't use it, or at least middle class South Africans don't use it for commuter purposes. We tend to see it as a relic of a bygone era. But for moving large volumes of goods, you can't beat it. It's just it's the most economical way to do things. And as one of our commentators said, the damage being done by trucks. I'd say not only the damage, but also there's a certain road hazard that goes with it. The last time I drove that route, I'm not a fan of driving after dark, but on the escarpment that goes between Mpumalanga and KZN, these trucks driving like bats out of hell, it was really very intimidating. Now, I wish a lot of that sort of thing could be on rail, leaving good burgers in their cars to proceed at whatever pace they're comfortable with.
Yeah, I actually, you bring up the safety of trucks. There was, I know yesterday, I think, a really horrible car accident at the Eastern Cape. Truck flipped over, squashed, and its trailer squashed a taxi, and everyone in the taxi was killed. It's like 15 people, including kids and stuff. Really horrible stuff. And I do, we kind of have this sort of like routine in the media of every year whinging about the horrible death tolls on the roads. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them, I'm sure, is the fact that we have to over-rely on our roads with lots of trucks. John, any final thoughts on this before we move on?
Well, maybe just also picking up on one of the comments in the chat, that this is one of the areas where you need government to do its job. Private sector can't really do it. Sort of. I know what you mean by that. It's one of those really capital-intensive industries where it's almost like a natural monopoly. But the thing is, I think the private sector does have a big role to play. Like if you, for example, concession stretches of the tracks or railways off to private players, you'd probably get a much better quality than what we've got at the moment. And I think that's where the kind of solution logic lies. That you say, good, Kumba, we're going to give you responsibility for the following corridor, or the coal mining industry for that matter, all the way through to Richards Bay. That's your job. Make sure it works. Make sure there's no crime on that line. Make sure the infrastructure doesn't get stolen. It's well maintained, and then at least that works. So you can get the private sector involved in that sense. Give them the authority to run it properly, have it run properly, and then Bob's your uncle. Easy, Nick.
Yeah, well, just on that, one of the kind of natural monopolies, like the very function of a state, is the maintenance of law and order. I don't think that there is any substitute for a properly functioning police force, or I should actually say police forces, because I think one of the problems we have here is that our policing is overly centralized. But the reality is that we just don't have such a service. So if that is filled in, however imperfectly, by private security, then that is the best of the available universes of solutions we have at the moment. Ultimately, however, you want the services provided by the state to be able to function, either on their own or in collaboration with some sort of private sector partnership, or perhaps even in competition with them.
Yeah, exactly. I think any new government, if it takes power after the next election, day one, the main priority should be to at least start off with repairing the police force, because if it is not repaired, you're going to have a lot of difficulty in fixing South Africa's other problems.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so let's move overseas to a case that doesn't really affect us, except it does, because it is important in the battle of ideas. And this is the US Supreme Court made a ruling on affirmative action. And it's amusing how much of this debate sounds exactly the same as the debate we have in South Africa. So there were two cases before the US Supreme Court, one to do with Harvard University and one to do with the University of North Carolina. And the accusations made here were that Asian Americans were being discriminated against because they are a very large percentage, way above their proportion of the population. getting into American universities. Asian in the American context means people both Indian and sort of Far East Asian, Chinese, Japanese descent, and that these groups are being discriminated against in the admissions policy of these universities. In a lengthy ruling, the majority of justices, I think it was 6 of them, so all of the so-called conservative justices, said that it violated the American Constitution's Equal Protections Clause to consider race in university admissions. Chief Justice Roberts wrote in the judgment, a student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Many universities have for too long done just the opposite, and in doing so, they have concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges based at skills built or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. So about 40% of US universities consider race in some fashion in their admissions policy. There was quite a lot of pushback to this. There was a dissent written by the 3 judges who didn't vote the way of the majority here, who said that discrimination still exists in America. Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest member of the court, said that with let them eat cake obliviousness, today the court's majority pulls the ripcord and announces colorblindness for all by legal fiat, by deeming race irrelevant in law, but deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. And Justice Sotomayor said, the court cements a superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. John, what's your take on this, on the politics of it? Will it affect South Africa? What's your thoughts?
Well, there's certainly echoes of the debates we have here in South Africa as well. And I think from the IRR's perspective, of course, this is something we're going to welcome. I think it's wonderful that racial discrimination is being effectively outlawed in university admissions. What is an interesting observation for me is how these kinds of really difficult questions are debated in the United States, how that nation figures out how it wants to move forward in things. And I get the impression that it is debated at a high level. So the progressive or left-wing justices put forward their views very eloquently. So do the more conservative judges. You get to some sort of resolution, and that you can be sure is a temporary. It's only going to be a temporary equilibrium, So things keep moving on, either the one way or the other. And what is going to be interesting for me is to see whether this judgment is going to be seen as having been 10 years ahead of its time in terms of where American society is, or 10 years behind its time. And we'll only see that as things unfold. But my suspicion is that maybe we are seeing a slight shift in the acceptability of racial discrimination in employment or admissions, and maybe a shift away from that acceptability, which would be good. Nick.
So the interesting little caveat they made here was that the ruling doesn't apply to military academies, with Roberts in his ruling saying the potentially distinct interests that military academies may present mean that you may still keep some race-based admission system in that context. Terence, what's your thoughts on this ruling before we close out?
I think, and I've said this many times on the show, and I think also in writing, that the experience in one country is not transferable to another. But I do think that there is a great impulse to on the part of many people to sort of fight these battles vicariously. So that I think makes it an interesting and relevant thing to talk about. My own sense is that the criticism that was made about race always mattering, I think that there is value to that, but I also think that it's important to bear in mind that these things are not static. American society in the 1700s is very different from what it was in the 1800s, from the 1960s to now. I understand it's 1 in every 18 marriages in America, I think, are cross-cultural. Plus, there's also enormous diversity within. If you're a black person in America of recent West Indian provenance, your socioeconomic profiles might be very different from whether you are, let's say, a native black African American, and that also is split between whether you came from the South the Northeast or from California, plus your class position, which is also, someone living in a middle class suburb in Cincinnati is going to be very, very different from someone living in what the projects, as they call them, in Los Angeles. Same, incidentally, with East Asians. Japanese Americans are one of the most successful groups. Vietnamese Americans, very, very different. And also, apparently, amongst Asians, big differences between men and women. So look, I do think that there's there is some scope for saying, well, no, actually, you need to think about this in more detail. Funnily enough, I would be opposed to saying that this is entirely illegal. If you're talking about private institutions. But that all being said, I think John is correct that there is a level of maturity here that we would do well to emulate. Just on the question of the military, I remember reading about this some time ago. Apparently, what happened, this may have changed since the piece I read, but the American military does its promotions on the basis of, well, it factors in various things, one of which is the racial mix of people to be promoted. The top 20% are shoo-ins, irrespective of whether that group is 100% of whatever group. The bottom 20% will not be promoted, irrespective of whether they are all like that. It's with that 60% block, and on occasion there are some hurt feelings and questionable decisions. But it's interesting that looking at America's experience in Somalia, in Desert Storm, I imagine probably somewhat different in the more recent conflicts, there wasn't a single case of racial violence or racial tension that was serious enough to report to the military police. The U.S. military is kind of universally recognized as one institution that is probably as close as you get to strictly meritocratic. And also, what they say, funnily enough, the one institution where black men routinely, bully younger white men.
Interesting. Okay, well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you found the show interesting. We'll be back tomorrow on the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone. Have a good day.